Okay, welcome back, listeners, to another episode of It Might Be Interesting. Josh, you have a topic that you've been anxious to talk about. Tell us, what are we going to be talking about today?
Yeah, so a little while back, close to the end of last year, my brother and I caught a show on TV on BBC. That was a show we watched growing up. I can't remember right now for the life of me what the name of the show was. It was about these two kind of middle-aged, slightly older women, chain smokers, living together, and it was a sitcom, and in this scene, one of them comes out of the room, like breasts hanging out, and asking, how do my breasts look, and are they too saggy? And they were, basically down to the floor, and it was the whole, comic bit of the scene. And we remembered that scene from when we were kids growing up, watching the show with our parents, and it made me realize how different it is overseas compared to here when it comes to sexuality, nudity, and everything in the media and attitudes. I wanted to kind of evaluate, take a look at sexuality and culture, and the more research I did, just the more fascinating, interesting, some of it a little upsetting. It was a truly fascinating subject, so I'm really excited. You're listening to It Might Be Interesting with your hosts, Josh Levy
and John Walsh.
Now, there's an endless amount of information out there on any given topic.
And sometimes you just need somebody who can extrapolate it in a way that might be interesting. So I'm glad you gave that example of the English show. Mm-hmm. I've always seen sex on television as kind of overdone. People just freak out about it. Mm-hmm. And the example I always give is, imagine I got invited onto Jimmy Kimmel.
Right.
And I'm sitting there with Jimmy Kimmel, and I'm holding up two photos of the same actress. And one is of her on a ABC type of show, like a detective show, and she's playing a homicide victim where she's been, raped and murdered, and the detectives are trying to figure out who done it.
Right.
And she's in makeup, and on the floor or whatever. And then the other picture would be one of her smiling brightly in front of a white backdrop, wearing blue jeans and nothing else.
Right.
Which one would get blurred?
Yeah, exactly. The topless one,
Yeah. It never made sense to me. And I always saw it as a Puritan type of view, something passed down from the Pilgrims type of thing. Mm-hmm. Am I off base on that? How does purity work into this? What's a Puritanism in its most undiluted form? What is that?
Yeah, that's an interesting example, because I remember in college where there was a very controversial photograph that was pulled from art galleries and then put back up, because the whole debate was, is this pornography or art? It was a woman who was eating a bowl of cereal in the morning at her kitchen table with her legs up on the table, wearing that, I think it was either jeans or pajama pants, but she just didn't have a top on. There was nothing sexual. She woke up, didn't want to put on an uncomfortable bra and a shirt, and it was this kind of artistic photo, a sunrise, whatever, but it caused this huge outcry because it was called porn. And yet you can see horrific depictions of violence towards women, and even though they are presented in the context this is bad, it desensitizes people to that violence. But also, one theory is that violence is used in media to subsidize, the
lack of nudity, or
the lack of nudity and sexual, the sexuality and everything.
That's interesting, because the thing that I've always thought about the Jimmy Kimmel experiment thing is the pushback you would get is, oh, well, we got to protect the kids. Mm-hmm. The kids shouldn't be seeing that. Well,
right.
What are the kids more likely to see? A woman without her top on, or a woman who's been raped and strangled?
Yeah, and more importantly, in real life, walking down the street, what would you rather have your kids see? Not just what are they more likely to see? If you had a choice, my child walking home from school is either going to past a house where a woman has the has not put down the drapes or whatever and see her breasts or see a murdered woman. Like, what would you prefer? And it's one reason why there is that kind of belief of it is used to kind of subsidize it is there was a study mainly among like rodents and even chimpanzees and nothing too extensive on humans, but it found that the cluster of neurons that are activated when seeing anything sexual, like even if it's not like hardcore porn, if it's just a naked body, even in a comedic context, whatever, is the same cluster of neurons that are that can light up and be stimulated with depictions of action, violence, and it's more of just like the entertainment value. It's not like, oh, seeing a woman's breast makes me want to go out and go crazy, So it's almost like it feeds this part of the brain that people want more of. They want to see. They want, So there was that idea, and so I kind of wanted to. That kind of took me down a research path of like, Puritanism, and like you mentioned, what is like a sexual puritanical views and everything, and to kind of define it with puritanical views and repression and everything in media and in America and overseas. If like a puritanical view has nothing to do with someone's personal life and their actions. It is mainly the view and beliefs that are enacted in culture. Like, for instance, you could be extremely sexually promiscuous in your private life, but be, very outwardly offended by the Janet Jackson halftime Super Bowl nip slip, and that makes you puritanical. You could be a virgin until marriage, like goody two-shoes in your personal life, but have no issue at all seeing the nip slip at halftime. Right. And that means you aren't puritanical. So it is more of a cultural outwardly view of that involves like how should we act, how should we perceive relationships, how should we perceive individuals, groups, women in sex, men in sex, roles like nudity, everything like that, and how it pertains to possibly links to, violence, how it affects desires, fantasies, everything like that.
Okay. Well, let's take a look at some of your research.
So, John, one of the most informative sources I came across was this book called Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. Okay. So this book was really interesting because this researcher named Justin Lee Miller is a doctorate. He has his doctorate in sexuality research and sociology, I believe, and he did the world's largest study and survey on sexual desire and fantasies, and went to, it looks like, over 20 countries, over 10,000 participants, I believe, in many of those countries. So it was around 50,000 people, and looked at everything: gender, sexual orientation, age group, race, things like that, and actually found out some things that may or may not surprise you. And one of the main things is that no matter who you are, where you live, where you grow up, anything, like every person out there has a fantasy that is just, let's just say, taboo in many cultures, or would make a lot of people, would make grandma blush. Sure. And so the whole point is that, we do culturally have this repression that is either based on, trying to create like a culture that is not too sexually promiscuous, or it is based on the fact that, we, a lot of people are ashamed. A lot of people think, oh, is this normal? Is this, and there are some that are kind of extreme that have perplexed a lot of researchers. There's one, here are two examples. Do you know what the fastest growing, and I think maybe now is even the number one category for porn in at least the United States?
Man, I don't know. Lesbian porn? I have no idea.
Family role play.
What?
Like, me and stepmom kind of.
That's the fastest growing?
By far.
No joke.
They say even, they've only been gathering statistics on like categories and stuff for about 10 years.
Did he explain why?
Well, that's the thing is like there are several theories. One being, it is a pendulum swinging, and this is like a good theory, like even though it's kind of bizarre, it's the pendulum swinging away from like very aggressive, violent porn.
Huh.
People are kind of
But still, I mean, that's a territory you wouldn't want it to swing towards.
And yeah, exactly. And, part of it is just the taboo nature of it, which also relates to one of the most, I think it's the second or third most popular or common fantasy among women, heterosexual women who have had this fantasy at least once, which, let me say, I think we can say unequivocally, of course, agree that there isn't a single woman on planet Earth who would actually want to be sexually assaulted or raped. But a rape fantasy is among, second to third most popular. And that really perplexed, because it's like, look, once again, they don't actually want to... they only fantasize about it in a consensual setting. They don't actually want someone to come in and sexually assault them. But it was like, why would someone want something like that? Why would they want to? And it is that taboo kind of pushing things to the extreme. Things are different from 10 years ago where it was like two cheerleaders in a shower.
Yeah, yeah. So like... Too cheerleaders. Like the way I've seen sexual repression, or the way I've always kind of thought of it, is a balloon that is kind of quasi inflated, and when you press down on one side, another side expands.
Right.
So, and then you press down on that side, and the other side expands. Whoops. So I guess like, what is the reason for the repression? What does he correlate as to why we have these taboos in our culture, and like, why is there such a starkly different fantasy between men and women? Is it that we simply don't talk about it?
Well, actually, it's interesting you ask, because first of all, when it comes to like the fantasies and desires that seem to be getting more extreme or whatever, the one evolutionary example is human beings, Homo sapiens, have a harder time reproducing than just about any other mammal or species on Earth. Like, you take, even a lot of other primates, the female goes into heat, usually one sexual encounter, pregnant, boom, done. Mm-hmm. And for humans, like even at peak ovulation or whatever, there are couples who have sex like all the friggin' time, day in and day out for months and months, years, and fail to get pregnant and then finally do. So the whole purpose, the evolutionary reason for, constantly coming up with and having these fantasies that are, maybe a little more extreme or out there is because we need to be interested in sex like all the time. If you think about if you took up a sport like golf and you got bored with it, would you continue golfing or not?
Right.
Like,
yeah.
So you gotta. It is not because, once again, like women want to be abused or because some guy wants to sleep with his stepmom.
Right. Yeah.
It's just because we have to keep our interest there.
So does Dr. Lee Miller say that this is a natural thing to have these sort of repressed fantasies?
Yeah.
Does he feel that they should be discussed openly or kept private, or what's the view on that?
Yeah, he does. He doesn't go too much into like, hey, this is what we should do. We should, even though he does suggest that like, hey, you can, like, everyone is thinking something as extreme or crazy as you are, so you shouldn't be as ashamed. He said, but the reason he didn't go too much into suggesting that is because there are evolutionary reasons for it, like people who, and also cultural, like people who have grown up with the most hardcore religious background. Actually, that was it, where overall that rape fantasy was number 3, but in for women who grew up in very conservative religious household, it was number 2. And that was like a more extreme example. And the thing is, there are evolutionary reasons why it's kind of taboo, especially, and God, this is crappy to say, it's obvious, like there's a double standard for men and women, and a lot of it has to do with our biological need for monogamy, and to know that the women we are with are not going to go out and have kids with someone else and everything. Yeah. So a woman who is more open, or displays even in nonverbal ways sexual promiscuity or proclivity to anything like that, is perceived from an evolutionary perspective as more likely to have wandering eyes, or want to sleep with the pool boy, which is why
it's the scarlet letter effect.
Yeah, and it's why we kind of laugh at the idea of a porno where like the pizza boy shows up.
Right. Yeah.
But originally, like that was scandalous. Like cheating. That was crazy. And so, and it's all because if you ask any woman on earth how many kids have you given birth to, they would be able to tell you with 100% accuracy. But for men, you see on Maury, like a dude raising his 10-year-old son, and 10 years ago his wife had a one-night stand with his best friend, and the DNA shows he's not the father.
Right, yeah.
So that's one of the evolutionary reasons. He explains why we see in so many cultures a lot of the policies, the views about sexuality, and a lot of the laws and everything disfavor women significantly, and are more oppressive in that sense.
So is the United States better or worse on sexual repression? Where do we rank? How do we, what does he say about that? Did you find any research on the United States, or just the Western or developed world, and our views on sex?
Yeah, and it was funny. When it comes to sexual behavior and activity, so this is not, in terms of the puritanical views or anything. This is just, what do you do in your bedroom? There was almost no difference between the U.S., England, Germany.
The behavior wasn't different.
Yeah, like the moment that bedroom door is closed, boom, it's everybody pretty much the same, or what they desire before they get to that bedroom, same thing. But when it came to attitudes, which translated a lot into media and puritanical views, still about a third of Americans believe that extramarital sex, or sex before marriage, things like that, are not as good as waiting till marriage. In France, 4% of people, to them, it's just not a big deal.
So why the barrier?
The barrier,
that's a 26% difference in a view of premarital sex. What is it the Atlantic Ocean? What is causing the difference?
Yeah, it's weird because a lot of the suggestions are based on religion, and here's the problem is, you go to Spain, Italy, per capita, there are more people who are Christians in the sense where they say, yes, I believe in God, I'm Christian. Yet they're, they joke about how many mistresses their prime minister has.
Right,
it's just really, they have nude beaches. They have,
topless beaches and nudity on television without caveat.
Yeah, and here we do have a different brand of religion that is more the evangelical, kind of Protestant-based, Puritan.
Pilgrims and, Puritans.
Well, that's it. And it's funny you mentioned pilgrims, is because we, from the very beginning, it was a nation where we were kind of having to mingle with and trade with and live amongst like very different, like these Native American Indians, and it wasn't we as a nation have never ever been racially or ethnically homogenous.
So that's what I was going to ask you next is, we were talking about the balloon that gets compressed. Is porn in many ways that compression? Is it the expansion of the other side? If you're repressing it in everyday culture, it expands in sort of an underground or a counterculture.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of probably the most interesting debates, and one thing I actually highly recommend. I hope it's still on Netflix. If not, probably Amazon Prime. You got to check it out. Is a documentary called Hot Girls Wanted. Documentary done by Rashida Jones, and it is a fascinating look into the world of pornography and how it really makes you. It's an eye-opener in terms of like consent. You think, oh, it's aggressive or violent, but she agreed to do it. She consent. Right. Well, a lot of these girls, packed up from Iowa, moved to California. They're broke as hell, don't know how they're going to make rent. So they will agree. They do give consent to something that they really wouldn't consent to. It's just more out of desperation. And so there's that line that's really blurred, and it's an eye-opener. But she also goes into statistics on how the porn that is made and produced here in the United States, roughly 3 out of 4 depict violence or aggression towards women, whereas in a country like France, where 4% of people believe it, don't have sex before marriage, it's almost like 1%. France, they make porn. Right. Germany, we know Germany makes porn, sure, but it's not like depicting acts of violence or even like our porn blurs the line more between consent when like the theme or the topic or the it's like some of that family role play is like, no, I don't want to, and it really blurs that line, whereas other countries, they don't really need to. They don't feel the need to do that. So the idea is like, is this a causation? Is it correlation? The concern is when you don't have it in media, when you don't grow up with it being like, oh, it's a naked person, and when especially you aren't really taught much about it in schools, it's not talked about at the dinner table as much because it's taboo. And when you combine all of those, in other countries, men learn, they get a little bit of sex education from porn, which is not good. Porn isn't realistic, whatever, but it's not the predominant source of like, oh, this is what women want, or this is how I need to be, or women think, oh, this is how I need to be. It's actually shaping a lot of views that women have in terms of what men want, how they should be in bed and things like that. In other countries, it's not as much of an influencer in that sense, but here, when a breast comes out on halftime where the nipple's even covered up, and right, that's, oh my God, world is coming to an end. When you go to porn, it's like the only outlet. So like you said, that balloon, it is like this really hyper-focused area. So
I didn't see the Rashida Jones film, but I did read some stuff by a former New York Times columnist. I think his name's Chris Hedges. He does a lot of stuff on the porn industry, and he talks in the same broad terms. He talks about how many of them are addicted to painkillers. It's a disturbing business with no recourse for these women, mainly women, and some men that are not just in it for the money, but are being, essentially tortured by being part of that occupation.
Right, and the more extreme you go, the more you push your boundary, the more they're going to pay you for a scene, and so there is that drive, especially knowing like, it's not the type of career usually that the actresses do well into their 50s or 60s. They know that their acting career in porn has a pretty short shelf life, and it's rare that someone finishes porn and then goes on to be CEO of a Fortune 500 company. Like, there's that taboo associated with it. So it is hugely problematic. It does objectify women. However, there is the good news, like, since it has been so extreme and it is almost like ballooned out of control with a lot of things that are, I think Rashida Jones mentioned how like 10 years ago, if you just typed the word extreme into a porn site, it's really like, whoa, out there, almost there for more the shock value than the arousal.
So let me switch gears a little bit. I mean, over the past 50 years, we've had advancements. We've had the women's liberation movement and the sexual liberation movement and things like that. And many would point to it and say that's progress. Is it progress? Where are we at on that? And is it what's the catalyst of these that causes these sexual revolutions?
Yeah, and so that's a good question, because we have seen revolutions, like think of the hippie movement, where there were women who were, in a much more conservative time in our history, just in the 1960s, 50, 60 years ago, who would go out in the streets in this parade, take their top off, be topless with a joint in their hand. And, it actually at first was scandalous, and then very quickly became just like the hippie norm. Right. And, it kind of transcended into a hippie movement of like nudity as art and all this like expressionist stuff, and which was really good, except it also started to divide people on the progress. So, for instance, like I mentioned earlier, there's kind of like this split. It's hard to say, the percentage of the split, but there's like two ideologies behind like some of the modern day feminism, where there's a lot of feminists who would look at that movement and say, like, that's it. Like, women can do what they want. They can sleep with who they want. They should be able to take off their damn shirt. Like, without, just because a woman has her breast out does not give someone the right to just go up and, do anything. And then there's the other school of thought, which is, this movement actually contributed more to objectifying women. The school of thought I am from kind of kept the door open for what we have today with more aggressive porn or whatever, and there's dispute in that, and it also helps the opposition, like the hardcore conservatives. They just used that as propaganda, those photos of the hippies with their tops off, so it just further polarized it more and more lately. I don't know if you've heard of a movement or more a group that has grown in size called incels.
I have heard of this.
Yes. We have seen on several occasions the consequences for a man who believes women are the source of their problems can play out in catastrophic ways. The Parkland shooter. Yeah. Girl says no to prom, and that like sets him off, after he's never been able to get a date. And I think there is a problem with, yes, there are the type A incels. And it's funny, there was actually a YouTube video of, the Ask Me Anything, like Reddit Ask Me Anything of an incel. And he came out and he was a lot more type B. And he was the type of person who like struggled to find a date. He was, more and more cast as like the loser, and especially on social media when your world is 10 times, 1,000, billion times bigger than just your immediate friends and classmates. I mean, that is amplified. You are, everyone else is getting late. You are a loser times a million. And so it really drives you farther into like this group where he just kind of mopes with some other dudes, and apparently he had like lost 100 pounds in the last year or so, and he had been doing things, but he also had some, it was like, you'd look at him and you'd think, man, this dude like couple things. He's got the potential to go out, land dates left and right. And then he would say things like, yes, men are entitled to, and women should play more of a motherly role at home. And it's like, God damn, but that's because he has lived in this sphere. And the problem is the concern, like this can, in an optimistic view, this all can change. I think, we've seen a few attacks by these incels and everything, but a lot of them, and the reason they don't speak out is because a lot of them are that like type B shy dude who doesn't know like where he fits in. So to expect them to take a more active role, and instead it's like immediately belittle that, these incel losers or whatever. And the challenge though, here's where it gets like kind of depressing with all of this.
Yeah.
You're familiar with the bell curve.
Yeah.
So the bell curve, and for anyone listening, like there was actually a book published in, I believe in 1994, a man named Charles Murray published a book called The Bell Curve, and it was basically a cautionary tale where he basically said, 500 years ago, if you had an IQ that was 20 points higher than your neighbor, it wasn't that consequential for your neighbor because you both like were farmhands, right. But as society and culture has advanced, and now, the difference between someone with a 100 IQ and a 120 in terms of the success and then availability to resources, he argues like this is one of the reasons why, despite policy can help, but the rich will continue to get richer. Like people are getting left behind. He was kind of raising the red flag. Unfortunately, the reason why that whole study, his whole book was admonished and he has been, kicked out of every intellectual circle is because there was one chapter in there called IQ and Race. And, his like spin on it was like, we need to be compassionate to races with lower IQ. And it was like, And he was citing research that was, bogus anyway. Like they'd look at Asian people who had graduated college versus like just a random sample of people in Mexico and be like, yep, look.
So it didn't age well.
Yeah, it didn't. Yeah. And even the research itself was so illogical and so bogus that, it was clearly a huge fumble. But I think the other part, like this bell curve, is really important because it is basically stating that we will continue to see a growing percentage of incels. To kind of close things out, and if you have any closing remarks, I'd like to hear them, but I want to hear what a lot of the listeners have to say
me too.
About sexuality in America. Do you think it is, is it a causation of a lot of the issues we have, violence and everything, or is it correlation? Is it, what are your thoughts on where we're going? Do you think it isn't ridiculous? Do you think it's good that nudity is censored? Like we want to hear these points because, as I said, there's research from a lot of different points of view that have very valid and credible arguments. So definitely send us your thoughts at itmightbeinteresting.com or on Twitter. Contact us, send us your thoughts because we really like these perspectives.
Yeah. Josh, always a pleasure.
Absolutely. Thank you, John.
We'll see you next week. Thanks for listening to It Might Be Interesting. Please join us next time.
And make sure you check out our website for other episodes, itmightbeinteresting.com. And we'd love to hear any thoughts, questions, feedback, and even episode suggestions you have. So if you do have any, please send it over to thoughts@itmightbeinteresting.com. Very different, which puts like a ridiculous burden on women to feel like they need to look a certain way. That is almost getting like worse and worse. We see campaigns like the Dove campaign for, celebrating women with an average body, and it has no effect at all on their revenue. They're like it makes, they get maybe 2 days worth of praise on social media for having women with just average bodies on a commercial. And then it's back to, oh my God, look at how beautiful she is.